With all that's going on with mortgage fraud in terms of AG Letitia James, as well as Fed Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, what the heck is it? What is mortgage fraud and why is this an issue? I'm going to break this down for you. Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this is The Breakdown. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Legal AF for all news, political, and legal. So, I figured since we're talking so much about mortgage fraud in the context of Attorney General of the state of New York, Letitia James, now facing mortgage fraud charges, as well as Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, who has had mortgage fraud allegations leveled against her. There is no case pending, but well, let me rephrase. There is a case pending in terms of whether or not the president has the power to remove her, but there is no criminal case currently pending against her. I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive into what mortgage fraud is and basically, is there any path forward for either one of these cases, being the active case with AG James, as well as the potential case with federal Governor Cook. So let's break this down. What is mortgage fraud? So, mortgage fraud involves deceit or misrepresentation in the origination or the funding of a mortgage loan, which is something that's relied upon by the lender. It is a white-collar crime and a felony that is investigated by the FBI. There's two main types of mortgage fraud. One is fraud for profit, which is something that brokers, appraisers try to get in and manipulate the process because they want to steal cash or equity out of the house. And then the other type, which is a bit more common, is fraud for housing, where a borrower provides false information in order to qualify for a loan or to buy a home for personal use. So, what does the prosecution have to prove? Now, again, I said this was a federal crime, so this would be handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office of whatever jurisdiction. So, proving a mortgage fraud requires the prosecution to demonstrate that a specific federal statute was violated and that the defendant acted with criminal intent. So, first off, in order to establish jurisdiction, it has to involve a federally insured financial institution. So we're talking about an FDIC insured bank, which is the majority of the banks that one would be getting a mortgage from. Also, it could be a federal agency or a government-backed loan, like a VA loan or an FHA loan, which usually helps first-time home buyers, that sort of thing. And it can also involve the use of interstate communication. So basically, it's a mail thing or a wire transfer in order to make the scheme happen. So there are a couple charges that fall under the umbrella of mortgage fraud. So there's false statements to a financial institution, which is pretty much the most direct statute that you can use. It basically says that you cannot knowingly make any false statement or report or willfully overvalue any property for the purposes of influencing the action of a federally insured financial institution in connection with a loan application. So basically, you lied on the form. But you knowingly lied on the form, right? This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding, that sort of thing. There's two other options, including bank fraud, which is used for larger schemes, and that basically makes it illegal to execute a scheme to defraud a financial institution or to get money, funds, or other property owned by a financial institution by means of false or fraudulent pretenses. And then the last option that prosecutors can use is basically wire and mail fraud, which is when the scheme uses electronic communications, wire fraud, or the U.S. Postal Service, mail fraud, to execute or conceal the fraud. Now, most mortgage transactions almost always involve a wire transfer, for your, deposits or whatever the case may be. And of course, mailing documents, right? So these charges end up being pretty common. So there's a couple essential elements that a prosecutor has to prove. So first off, there was a false statement or omission. So the defendant must have made a material misstatement, misrepresentation, or an omission related to the loan. So that can involve inflating your income or assets. So basically I make $500,000 a year when you really make $100,000, right? Or I have 4 other properties, or I have, all these cars, all these physical assets from which that can basically change your financial picture, and that's really not true. It could also come in the form of omitting debt. So if you have a whole bunch of credit card debt, or you got back child support or something that you have not declared, that's a problem. Using a straw buyer, so basically having somebody else get the house for you because for whatever reason you're shady or whatever the case may be, or misrepresenting the property's occupancy. That's the big one, occupancy fraud. Second element. So first you had a false statement or omission. Second is materiality. So the false information has to be material, meaning it's super important and it would affect the lender's decision-making process. So basically, if the lender knew the information that you left out or the information that you lied about, right? If they knew the truth, they basically wouldn't have given you a mortgage. A minor unintentional error is not considered material. So food for thought on that. The third element is intent to influence. So that's a false statement that must have been made for the purposes of influencing the financial institution's decision to approve, fund, or insure the loan. And then lastly, and that's the tough one, and that's criminal intent. That's the knowingly, willfully aspect. The defendant must have acted knowingly or willfully, meaning that they knew the information was false and they intentionally submitted it for the purposes of deceiving the lender. This is the toughest part for prosecutors to overcome because it's a specific criminal intent, and how do you prove that someone was intentionally trying to commit fraud? So, the issue here that is at hand for both Attorney General James as well as Federal Governor Cook is that primary residence versus secondary residence. So in order to get a better mortgage rate, you want it to be your primary residence, right? Primary residences, again, you get homestead exemptions and stuff from your tax folks locally on the state level. And you get a better interest rate because that's where you're going to be living. Vacation homes, rental properties, all of that, because you're going to be making money on it, or it's not where you're going to be laying your head, that ends up having a higher interest rate. Now, a primary residence is a property that you occupy for a majority of the year, and that's considered 6 months or more. And it's the address you use on documents like your driver's license, your tax returns. So this is where everything is linked, right? Now, like I mentioned, primary residence mortgages have the lowest interest rates, and that's because also lenders view it as the lowest risk because they figure you're not going to default on the home that you live in because you need a place to lay your head. So that's the psychology as to why they give primary residences a better interest rate. So the occupancy fraud is the most common type of fraud for housing. And that's where a borrower lies about a second home or investment property and says, hey, this is going to be my primary residence to get the better rate. But here's what's interesting. And take a look at this mortgage form, right? And it says under here in part 2 that you're checking off whether or not it's a primary residence. It doesn't say that it's going to be your primary residence. It says it's going to be a primary residence. Why is that important? Well, in the case of Letitia James, the Attorney General for New York, where she was actually charged with checking off that it was a primary residence, she was co-signing a mortgage for her niece. So, let me break down what co-signing means. Because again, I don't want to assume that everybody has bought a house. There are plenty of people in this country who have not bought a home, have rented or are living with somebody else, or just never signed the actual mortgage papers to buy a home. No shame in that. So that's why I want to make sure everybody understands the process. So when all of this stuff is floating around out there, folks have a little better understanding of the terms and sort of the burden that the prosecutor has to overcome in order to prove their case. So co-signing a mortgage. A co-signer is someone who agrees to be legally responsible for someone else's debt. Okay, so someone else is a primary borrower, but you're over here like, hey, if they don't pay, I got this, right? So Attorney General James was like, hey, this is going to be my niece's spot, but If she has a problem, I'm the backup. I'll make sure that the mortgage gets paid. If the main borrower, so in this instance, A.G. James's niece, if the main borrower misses payments or defaults, then the co-signer is on the hook and has to repay the loan up to the full amount plus late fees. So you got to be real sure about somebody you're co-signing for, right? However, co-signing a mortgage does not give you any title, ownership, or other rights to the property that the loan is paying for. So basically, you're there on paper, but that's not your house. You don't own it, right? You have no right to it. So basically, you get all the debt with none of the benefit. That's really what a co-signer is. And when I say that you get all the debt, none of the benefit, if the person that you're co-signing for misses payments or defaults, the debt gets reported to the credit bureaus as your debt as the co-signer. So a missed payment by the borrower will appear on and negatively affect a co-signer's credit report. So again, you better be real sure about who you're co-signing a property for. Now, like I showed earlier, and I'm going to show this form again, mortgage documents often specifically ask about the occupancy intent of the person who will be living in the home. So even though the cosigner is financially responsible, the occupancy status is usually based on who will be the primary occupant. So again, in the case of A.G. James, her niece was going to be the primary occupant. So yes, it is right to check off that this was going to be someone's primary residence, but it wasn't going to be A.G. James's, it was going to be the niece's. What's interesting is that this is not the first time that we've heard of mortgage fraud instances, but for some reason they didn't get prosecuted. So cue Labor Secretary Lori Chavez de Raymer, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, and EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin were all found to have two concurrent primary residence mortgages on two separate properties. Charges filed anywhere? No? Gee, I wonder why. Also, some other people that have been in the frame for this are Senator Adam Schiff, who's a Democrat out of California, and former Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who's a Republican out of Texas. They faced accusations of taking out primary residence mortgages on multiple homes. But something to keep in mind. Mortgage fraud is something that's rarely prosecuted, especially for occupancy fraud, unless there's somehow like this large malicious scheme to defraud. So, there's a bunch of different houses that are involved, that sort of thing. Or if the borrower defaults on the loan and causes harm to the bank. So the bank is like, we're out $300,000. You got to help us. This is too crazy. We can't absorb this. That's when you often see these cases come into play. But what we have here, in my opinion, and I want to hear what y'all have to say about this, but what you have here to me is punishing Black women for being successful. Because the reality is, New York Attorney General Letitia James, she owns her house in Brooklyn, New York, right? She co-signed a house for her niece to help her family out. What's wrong with that? That's not only helping yourself, you're helping your family. You're making sure that your family members have a base in which to build and be successful. This wasn't, she just got 15 houses all over the place and is doing foolishness. She's literally helping a family member, right? So the fact that she is being charged with this, not only is it a political witch hunt, in my opinion, but it's also like, how dare you? How dare you actually have success? How dare you actually have more than one home? How dare you be above your station in these United States? Don't you remember your place? And, and again, when you're looking at the case of Lisa Cook, she made it very clear that, listen, this is my primary residence. Yes, I own a second home. That is not my primary residence. It is not illegal to have two homes in two separate states as long as they're not both listed as primary residences. So again, comes under the same narrative. How dare you have more than one home? How dare you be successful? How dare you have power and a voice in this country? So I'm seeing this as a total double standard, but maybe I'm missing something here. Sound off in the comments. I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this was The Breakdown. Stay safe, stay informed, and keep demanding justice. Take care.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.